this goes. But I am very, very excited to be able to talk to everyone today about this topic that emerged from data that we did with faculty at a research-intensive university. And I'm going to talk to you today about this phenomenon of epistemic exclusion. Theorists have posited that systems of oppression will combine with stereotypes and negative images of different social groups, and that will produce a set of people that become the acceptable bodies of knowers, and then those that are deemed outside of that body of knowers. And the people that become the knowers are then in a position to reify knowledge, to decide what is legitimate for knowledge, which things are outside of the realm of a particular discipline, and then who can be the bodies that produce that knowledge. So if we're talking about patriarchy, then women are stereotyped in negative ways, and that allows men to be defined as the true knowers. If we talk about racism, then that will combine with stereotypes about people of color, and will assume that they are incompetent, and then assert that white people are the right bodies of people to be knowers. And one consequence of these forces of knowledge oppression is what we've come to call epistemic exclusion. And epistemic exclusion involves devaluing or dismissing knowledge that's outside of the dominant discourse of a field. And in an academic context, this could mean that certain topics of scholarship, particularly things around race, gender, sexual orientation, social class, that those are deemed outside the norm of what's acceptable in a discipline. And a key feature of epistemic exclusion is that it also involves devaluing and dismissing the knowledge that's produced by marginalized group members. And because of their situatedness, or because of their social position, those marginalized group members have a very different lived experience from dominant group members, and this ends up further putting them on the margins. Epistemic exclusion, I often call it EE, you'll hear me say. EE can indeed happen intentionally. There can be someone who is deliberately bigoted or biased and decides they don't like these kinds of people, and they'll say such. But I think that what's much more insidious is when the ways it shows up unconsciously or subconsciously. Here, someone might have implicit biases, and rather than say, I don't like those kinds of people, they might come up with very sophisticated reasons for why they don't like certain bodies of research, and why certain bodies of research are not sophisticated enough to warrant inclusion in the field. And that becomes a way of no longer owning that they're also claiming that about the groups of people that actually do that work. So they can make the argument that research is not sophisticated enough for our field, and if people of color just happen to do more of that research, it's merely coincidence, it's not my bigotry. And so people with power are in a position to reject other individuals and reject other types of research and define what's going to be acceptable. They're able to establish and maintain disciplinary norms. And because excluding these other types of research and these other types of researchers is actually feeding into systems within the academy that have made them successful, they have zero incentive to begin to question the way they're doing science. As a result, the system continues to privilege the privileged. So to provide you with a little bit of context of what does academia look like, although I'm imagining everybody in this room knows, this is data from NSF in 2013, and it's showing the proportion of faculty from each of these various ethnic groups. And what jumps out at us is the proportion of faculty members that are white. What I'll tell you, though, is that this data is all faculty. So it's including adjunct faculty, it's including lecturers, which we already know disproportionately is embodied by people of color. If we look at research-intensive universities, which is very difficult to isolate that kind of data, these numbers are far more skewed. So what we have here, faculty of color have low representation, making them tokens within the academy. This is then combined with belonging to low social status groups. And these social status groups, most of which are also negatively stereotyped with regard to intelligence and knowledge production. So this makes them especially vulnerable to being cast outside of the norm of knowers within their institutions and within their departments. Furthermore, faculty of color are far more likely to study topics that cast them further on the fringe of the field by centering experiences of those that are marginalized and oppressed, and using non-traditional methodology and research methods. All of these cast them further from their disciplinary norms and expectations. So given the theories, given the literature, we conducted a large-scale study of faculty of color at a research-intensive university. And this study is far bigger than what I could actually cover if you gave me even several hours. But we have 118 faculty of color at a research institution doing one-on-one qualitative interviews that lasted from anywhere an hour to 2 hours. This literally is almost 2,000 single-space pages and 10.5 of data. I have a career for the rest of my life. And so I'm going to present to you only a tiny piece that's specific to epistemic exclusion, but there's far more that we'll be discussing. And actually, as was mentioned earlier, one of our articles is now available online at JUB, and I can talk to you about it later. So our questions: do faculty of color experience epistemic exclusion? How does epistemic exclusion manifest in academic spaces? And I'll briefly touch on how is it that faculty are coping with these kinds of experiences. So I've already talked to you a little bit about the method, but to give you a sense of our sample here, you can see it's pretty well balanced across factors like gender, nativity, language of origin, rank, race, STEM and non-STEM fields, and many of the social sciences like psychology are included in STEM as well. So this represents the people in the room. We did a thematic analysis from the data. This is important because it allows us to look at themes and discover themes that we might not have known were there, which is exactly what ended up happening with epistemic exclusion. This was not something we were looking for, but it's something that popped out frequently. To give you a brief overview of the other 2,000 pages of data, we found indeed that faculty did experience bias. 62% of the faculty talked about experiencing bias directly. They had their own individual personal stories of bias. 74% also talked about experiences that they had directly witnessed happening to others, or that they had heard about from the target or from somebody that witnessed the events. And 23% of the faculty talked about these strange body of experiences that reflected bias, but it seemed to specifically be focused on their research. Now I want to remind you, these were open-ended questions. We were not probing for questions about bias related to their research, so we can't take that to mean that only 23% of the population actually has this experience. All it means is that a quarter of the population spontaneously decided to mention this in these interviews. So bias based on research. In essence, we were observing epistemic exclusion without even knowing that that term existed at the time. Because to date, theories of epistemic exclusion have not been addressed in the field of psychology and have not been empirically examined. But we found that epistemic exclusion operated both formally through the valuing of certain types of scholarship, as well as the metrics that were put in place to evaluate scholarship quality. And we also found that it was functioning informally, and the kinds of messages communicated about what scholarship should be, who's being recognized and valued for that scholarship, which things are appreciated and recognized, and whose milestones were rewarded. So let's first talk about the formal ways, the formal hierarchies that constructed epistemic exclusion. Most often, faculty were spontaneously talking about the ways their scholarship was perceived as lacking in quality or value. Sometimes this was a general discussion of a lack of valuation, as illustrated by the quote here. My unit tends to be very traditional in how they conceptualize what academia is and what scholarship is. Very traditional in terms of fields. Like most of my colleagues don't recognize what I do. They just don't. That's why I'm in another department. In the other department, I'm sorry, I edited here, I'm reading you how they actually spoke, the difficulties they were having. My home department basically doesn't care, and they don't care about what I study. So it's taken me a while to maybe not to transition, but to come to terms with the fact that they will never be interested in what I do. They will never be interested in what I do. This participant's quote highlights a strategy that some of the participants were using to deal with epistemic exclusion, and that was looking for other places where they could be valued. This might be other spaces within an institution, like seeking out another department alliance. It could be the particular committees that they chose to participate within the institution. But far too often, it also included having to go outside of their institution altogether. Sometimes that's through societies such as this one here. Others, it was beginning to actually look for employment elsewhere. And sometimes the devaluation of their scholarship was directly related to comments about the quality. This might be related to methodology used. I don't feel valued in the department. I don't think people understand the kind of research I do. I don't think it's viewed as research because of the type of methodology I use. It's a very highly quantitatively inclined department. And other times, it was also because they were conducting research in a non-traditional context, such as international work. When I was hired, I made it very clear that international work is what I do. And I've never deceived anybody about the fact that I was going to continue doing international work. But within my department and within my own academic program, there was actually, at some point, my chair at that point told me very explicitly that we don't do international work here, so you better find something else to do. I love that. They hire you for who you are, and then they tell you to be something else. Community-engaged scholarship was also another type of non-traditional research context that was devalued. I do a lot of stuff with community, and I think the university appreciates that, but they appreciate it, but it doesn't count the same as if somebody was publishing an article. And it also applies to those doing socially engaged scholarship. And this is a long quote, but it really hits a lot of the core issues. Individuals who have research programs that are more problem-oriented, less theoretical, that deal with social issues that are not the traditional theoretical questions of the field, are treated as second-class citizens compared to those that do more traditional theory-based research. And there tends to be an overlap, an ethnic racial overlap in this. People from underrepresented groups tend to want to do research that's relevant to some of the social problems, and that research might not be along the lines of the more traditional frameworks or frames of reference. So it's hard to say what's the cause and what's the effect. Is the disdain for problem-directed research a form of channeling racial and ethnic prejudice, or is it a true value system that differs in terms of valuing theory-driven research more than problem-oriented, applied research? So it's hard to tell because there's an overlap in the individuals that tend to gravitate towards problem-oriented applied research. More persons of color go that way, for background reasons and for values that they're bringing in before they even adopt an academic career. Now this participant is asking for an either-or answer here, but perhaps it doesn't need to actually go as an either-or response. Maybe it's not a question of whether or not values, scholarly values at least, are driving this, or is it who's doing the research that's driving these opinions about the research. Epistemic exclusion proposes that what's most likely is that it's both. That they're devaluing the problem-oriented social justice research because it is being conducted by and for racial ethnic minority faculty. And another way that formal hierarchies contributed to epistemic exclusion was through changing and unclear standards and expectations. For example, shifting standards of what is needed for promotion and tenure, as this quote illustrates. The first year I was here, everybody I asked gave me a different number of publications, and they were all bigger and bigger and bigger. And then I asked the same person again, and they gave me an even bigger number. It was like the carrot kept moving. I decided that I had no other choice besides to run and sprint, right? Get as much out as I could, do everything I could within reason, and just see where the chips fall. What's interesting is this was captured by several of the participants. Many of them talked about this idea of they say the tenure expectations are really clear, but that it keeps being a moving target. And ironically, that target kept moving every time they actually hit the target. So others talked about how they had only vague or unclear ideas of what was expected of them. there was an expectation that you would publish in certain journals, in certain areas, and so we asked the dean, well, what are those journals? You know, which ones are the ones we should be shooting for? Which ones are the ones we should avoid? His response, we can't answer that question. So you have an expectation that you can't possibly meet, essentially. So both the moving targets and the lack of clarity make it difficult for faculty of color to meet the expectations of the disciplines and be successful in this academic context. Formal hierarchies of epistemic exclusion also were reflected in the need for grants. And participants talked about the need for external grants as creating this hierarchy of who in the department would be valued, as these three very short quotes will show you. In my department, how do I want to phrase this? Well, first and foremost, you're valued if you bring in money. So in that sense, no, I'm not valued right now because I haven't brought in any money. So I'm just trying to be fair. Like, I'm trying to think of a fair way to say it. No, I can't be valued because I don't generate revenue that's necessary. For people to value you, well, I guess that's all I'll say. My department values me now, right? And the current chair values me now. But on the other hand, you gotta see what I brought in. I brought in 1.4 million in a whisper. So this idea of this valuation was mentioned by people throughout the fields, largely in the STEM fields, but also many of the social sciences talked heavily about the use of grants to establish a hierarchy of value. And these multiple quotes show that these pauses and the difficulties they were having in finding the words and getting it out, that when they talk about how grants are establishing their value, they're trying to communicate something that is so amorphous that they struggle, academics struggle to find words. And yet another of the formal hierarchies that were creating epistemic exclusion was by granting certain journals or publishers higher status, and thus conferring greater value to those who do publish in those spaces, and devaluing the work of faculty of color and not understanding that the work faculty of color produce are often unwelcome in those journals. And this was evident in a number of ways. It was evident in the listing of what are the top journals and the consideration of impact factors, the devaluation of race-ethnic journals, the focus on citation counts, and all sorts of ways in which scholarship was evaluated. They're trying to determine through a combination of impact factors and citations and all these things, which citations really kind of matter and which ones don't. That's going to always leave people who do non-traditional research on the margins. Always. There is a deliberate change where they're trying to articulate what are the top journals and want everybody publishing in those top journals, which, once again, always feels marginalizing because, you know, the top journals are not in any of the specialty journals. The journals that are top for ethnic minority studies don't have the same impact factor because they don't have the same circulation. So the plethora of formal manifestations of epistemic exclusion make the tenure and promotion process incredibly difficult to navigate, especially given that those faculty who do indeed actually hit these marks, even then find that the target just keeps moving on them, and they don't get the same kind of information nor the same kind of opportunities to foster success. So those were some of the formal ways that epistemic exclusion manifested, but it also was brought about through everyday conversations and various informal ways that they were told that they didn't have the same value. For some, I'm going to first share just some of the very generalized quotes. I remember there were many, many foot-and-mouth moments that really made it clear how little he valued the research I did, or valued me, or valued my group. But he was very, very powerful, very prolific, brought in tons of grant money. There was nothing to be done. It's very ironic in a department like this because people are nice, good, caring liberals. But liberal racism means that they do a lot of benevolent stuff, or they do a lot of stuff under the carpet. and they don't even acknowledge it. Ways that they discount your abilities or your personhood, and they just discount your very presence. Now, as somebody who's either done the interviews or transcribed the interviews and heard their voices, it's still painful to read some of these. You might get this 0.5% raise or something ridiculous. People generally get caught up when their salary is so far below everybody else at the same rank that they then get a salary adjustment. And it's not even a raise to recognize your work. It's saying, we've been paying you so little compared to what we pay everybody else, we need to bring you back into the fold. It feels good to get a raise, but it's not the same thing as saying, you have merit. We value you in this department. We value what you bring, so we're going to compensate you for it. It's very demoralizing to not get raises that reflect what you do. You have a year where you get 5, 8 publications out, but you still get a little pittance raise. It feels like a slap in the face. Informally, epistemic exclusion was communicated also by faculty not having their accomplishments recognized, even when they were meeting those formal metrics by the departments. And they were looking for recognition in a variety of different ways, not only through formal things like the salary increases and merit raises, and not only things like promotion and tenure, but also getting written or online mentions, being recognized on the website, getting verbal praise from colleagues. You're invisible. Your accomplishments are invisible. If you don't accomplish them, now then you will stand out. But otherwise, you're just doing what you're supposed to be doing, even though it's more than what other people are doing. So here, the participant provides an example of faculty of color not having their successes recognized in the ways that others' successes are recognized. And this consequence of feeling invisible within that setting and of not mattering whatsoever. But at the same time, the participant is able to recognize that they are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. In fact, they are doing more than the colleagues that are getting all of the recognition. And they're also recognizing that if by chance I fall off the wagon, I don't do what I'm supposed to be doing, well then I'm going to experience heightened scrutiny, and that will be vilified. So they talked about not having their grants or awards recognized in ways that their white colleagues' accomplishments are recognized, and many participants discussed ways that they were meeting the traditional metrics or even surpassing them, but still failed to receive even the smallest level of recognition that white colleagues received. The program that I run, and I have 5, 10 times the grant funding of the rest of the department combined. It's crazy. I will say my accomplishments have not been recognized very well here. When I go to conferences, go to other places, my colleagues all thought I was already a full professor because my research was valuable. They're always surprised why I still have not been given tenure. So being mistaken for a full professor when you haven't even been given tenure. And another way that epistemic exclusion was communicated was with a lack of basic comprehension of what the faculty member did, not being able to understand their scholarship, and as a result, they couldn't understand how it could be important. I've had the experience of being treated like the work I do is ancillary, of people kind of not really getting it, not being able to understand why it's important, and so just kind of being dismissive about it. So the lack of understanding is not only about the content, it's also about methodology, and it's about the extent to which they are different from what others are doing in the department. And what's also important here is this ongoing lack of curiosity from their colleagues. This idea that as academics, they would typically go to the literature, they would read up, they'd want to know, but when it came up to these topics, it wasn't worth their time. And individuals talked a lot about their community-based scholarship also not being understood. I always gather data in the field, so it adds one more step, because you have to have a relationship with the population, and then you have to have time to go out and do the data collection. And sometimes you have to just go out and familiarize yourself with the community and what you want to do. And I don't think mainstream really understands that. It's like, go out and ask questions. And I think you can do that mainstream if it's clear cut. But with ethnic minority people, their response is, I don't know about this. What are you going to do with this? Well, maybe, let us think about it, you can come back later. And one, they want to see if you're even going to come back. How many times will you come back? Because they've been mistreated this way, especially by research. So they're not going to be really open and trusting, even if you're a minority researcher. So this idea of what does it take to be successful as a community-based researcher doing work with ethnic minority populations was not evaluated, was not considered, and certainly was not valued. Okay, deciding what to cut because I'm in time. It was also informally communicated through messages that conveyed the faculty of color that they're not perceived as legitimate scholars or as having real scholarly abilities. I lived under the illusion that if I were a tall white guy and I had a research success that I do, I would not be treated the way I am. It would be all over the webpage. Everybody would be so thrilled. And instead, they treat me like I snuck in the back door and I'm trying to pull a fast one on them or something. And I just don't get it. I don't get it. And I don't know how you fix it, because I truly don't. I've thought about this. I should have a lot of influence in this department. I do not. I simply do not. So this participant is talking about the ways in which epistemic exclusion strips them of any power and any influence, and how dealing with inequity on a constant basis takes a lot of mental energy. This participant has been thinking about it and clearly struggling with the implications of this and why it's so. And in essence, this is what we call in political psych gaslighting, where reality really seems obvious, but everything is making it questionable. And the environment here is proof that you're worth it, and proof over and over and over. Yeah, you did that last year. Can you still do it again next year? Kind of mentality. In other words, you can never do enough. And there are also a variety of ways in which other faculty members just communicated a lack of respect for the faculty member. And they treated them, and even treated their students, in ways that communicated that lack of respect. So one person talked about their mentor, supposed mentor. She directly said stuff to me like, well, you're never going to be a superstar anyway. Yeah, that was pretty disrespectful. There is definitely a pattern of taking me for granted, pushing me around, not providing me the support, and I have a lot of evidence for that. Like, I got a grant. I was the PI on that grant. I was removed as PI without even checking with me. My effort on the grant was reduced without even checking in with me. Now that not only has career implications, but financial implications. I was in a meeting and a very prestigious male was talking about research and pointed to me and to the other person of color and was talking about the group and then the subgroup. And the subgroup consisted of me and the other person of color. And did this in a meeting with all of the faculty, and clearly had no idea, no awareness of how offensive what he had just done was, and how excluding it was. This is also someone who had been the chair of my review committee a few times, and that made it very difficult to be here, and to imagine that these people could fairly evaluate me for tenure. So these interactions seek to, at least they appear in my opinion, to try and put people in the margins back in their place, even further on the margins. The lack of respect communicates that they're not welcome, and it absolutely communicates that they don't belong. And it illustrates how this how this could also contribute to this leaky pipeline, to losing students along the way, because as they advance through their education and their professional lives, why would they knowingly enter into hostile environments such as these? Now, although I don't have time to talk about the outcomes of epistemic exclusion in detail, our interviews do suggest that epistemic exclusion has psychological outcomes such as distress, anger, lowered self-esteem and sense of self. Also, it has negative consequences for work outcomes like decreased productivity, barriers to advancement, and thoughts of or even efforts to leave the institution. But we also have to recognize that organizationally, there are significant costs for epistemic exclusion. Not only do these institutions find that their reputations are tarnished, which makes it difficult for them to retain the faculty of color that they have, but makes it almost impossible to recruit new faculty of color, graduate students of color, and even undergraduates of color. And there are extremely high financial costs associated with having to replace that one single faculty member. It's been estimated that it's up to 18 months of a faculty member's salary to replace them. So we have to do a much better job of making sure that all members of our academic community feel that they belong. So what we know that faculty are experiencing epistemic exclusion. and that this happens through a variety of formal mechanisms as well as informal mechanisms. And we know that the consequences of epistemic exclusion are grave. They're grave for the individual and for the institution, and I would argue that they're grave for the scholarship and the world of knowledge more broadly. See, as we lose scholars and we relegate entire bodies of knowledge to the margins, that can potentially be lost forever. So I'll quickly thank my collaborators, the MSU Office for Inclusion and Intercultural Initiatives that funded this incredibly comprehensive study, our project staff, and of course our faculty participants. And